project procurement techniques. Now, procurement is the work we do to engage and manage contractors and subcontractors or anyone providing a service to our project, or purchasing supplies or equipment which will be used for a building contract. So procurement, it covers anything we have to buy in for our project. Now, successful procurement management, the first, what do we have to do to be successful with procurement? And the first step we need to do is to develop a good plan and use robust procurement processes. As a project manager, the easiest way to get fired from your job is not to be using the proper processes for procurement. And believe me, in my career, I've seen plenty of people marched out the door for that particular reason. So it's a very important part of managing a project, or even if you're not the project manager, but you're responsible for procurement on a project, it's a very important job and one that is always under a lot of scrutiny. Now, there are different types of procurement. The first one is what we call sole source. And that means using just one pre-selected supplier. So many organizations, and especially probably smaller building companies, would have a preferred supplier especially for materials and equipment, but also with regard to maybe subcontractors. And it may depend on the area in which you work. So, of course, that's going to be a very efficient way of conducting procurement, because you don't have to spend time asking for quotations, etc. And you can actually engage that person directly. However, sole source isn't always available to you, or the person may not be available. So you may have to go out and request quotations from several suppliers. Now, they can be people on a preferred supplier list that you may already have in your organization, or you may just have to do some research and ask some suppliers in a particular area for quotations. And that's the most common way of procuring goods and services for smaller organizations or for smaller dollar value items. The third type is request for tender, and that's for large dollar procurement items. And that would be, for example, where a developer may request tenders from builders for a construction project. So you're looking at the big dollar work here, because tendering takes a long time. It's almost a project in itself. So it costs a lot of money to go out to tender, and there's a lot of formality about it. So that's something that I'm not going to dwell on today, because I'm assuming that most of you would be in the situation where you'd be either probably requesting quotations rather than going out to tender. But I'm happy to talk about it at the end if anyone's got any specific questions about tendering. I'll just take that on notice, I think, rather than have to go through the whole thing where people may be perhaps not so interested in it. So, but I might say the process is the same. It's just that there's a lot more rigor around tendering. Now, the different types of contracts before we need to just talk about that to start with. There are two main types of contracts, and the first one is fixed price contract, which means that the price can't be adjusted unless there's a formal variation or a claim is raised. So that's the most common type of contract in the building industry and in engineering industries as well, because the processes are very, very well identified in the building, in the construction and engineering industries. You find a lot of fixed price contracts. Now, if you happen to be an architect, that may not be so much the case. You may end up charging depending on the amount of work involved. So, for design type of work, fixed price may or may not be done. Now, the other type of contract is cost reimbursable contract, or cost plus. And this is where the contractor is reimbursed for the actual costs they incurred in carrying out the works, plus an additional fee. And that cost for carrying out the works can be labor and or equipment and materials. So, and there's always naturally an additional fee. So sometimes we call a particular type of cost plus contract is called time and materials. And that could be what architects might ask for in terms of doing design work. Now, so they're the main types of contracts: fixed price or cost reimbursable. Now, if you are, I'm going to concentrate on requests for quotation for work to be done, whether that be goods or materials or services from a contractor or subcontractor. Now, they must be given a clear description of what is required. Now, you should always put your requirements in writing when you're requesting a quotation. And even if it's a very simple one, you know, you can get on the phone and you can ask people for small quotes on this and that, but you need to be sure that people are giving you quotes on the same thing. Now, if you just ring people up and ask them for quotes, they may not fully understand what you want. And you may have expressed yourself slightly differently on the phone for each one of those suppliers. So even for a very small quote for something very small, where you mightn't actually have a very formalized process, always at least back up your phone call with an email where you actually detail what your requirements are, because that way you'll make sure that they're actually all quoting on the same thing. It's very easy to misinterpret verbal conversations. Now, if you're requesting quotations for slightly larger work, then you should have a formal process to go through. Now, the first thing you must do is develop a requirements document. It doesn't have to be huge, but it should be very clear and specific about what you want. And the sort of things that would go into a requirements document would be, first of all, a statement of the work that needs to be done overall. You would supplement that with any plans and specifications that might be applicable to that job, any site information that would be relevant for that particular contractor, time frames, very important. And first of all, the time frames for when you need the response back from them and when the decision will be made. Also, you need to give them the time frames of when the goods or services are required. They need to know what dates that they will be required. Now, if there's any uncertainty about dates, and it can be on contracts for building services for subcontractors, then you need to be very specific about that as well, and make sure that they understand that there could be some movement in those dates if that's a situation you're in. Now, you also need to provide them with information about what the important things are about your selection, how you will select the the supplier or the contractor. What's important? We all know that price isn't the only thing. So what else is important about the selection? And to give them some clue as to whether they should be putting effort into even replying to your request for quotation. And I'll talk more about selection criteria in a little bit later. Now, also, you need to advise them of what documentation they need to supply, and that could be things like licenses, insurances, maybe even references to other jobs that they have performed, and particularly if you don't know them. And also what type of contract will be used. That is, will it be a fixed price or a cost plus contract? So they're the sorts of things you need to put in your requirements document, and be very specific about what they need to do. And also any exclusions from what they would be doing as well, if that's applicable. Now, that requirements document should be emailed to your selected list of potential suppliers or contractors. And of course, as we said before, making sure that they understand when you require the response from them. Now, once you've got the responses, it's very important that you choose the right contractor, because that's going to be critical to a successful delivery of your project. Now, you need to determine what the evaluation criteria you're going to use will be. And typical ones that you would use, and let's remember that price isn't the only thing. Just because someone quotes the lowest price, it doesn't mean it's in the end going to be the least expensive option. So price is definitely important as an evaluation criteria, but also their understanding of your requirement. In their response, they should be indicating that they really understand how they're going to deliver the work and provide an explanation of how they're going to deliver it, if that's appropriate. You need to perhaps think about their experience and expertise, evaluate that. Also, their ability to deliver within the time frame. Previous similar projects they may have undertaken, because that'll be also contributing to their ability to deliver and experience to deliver what you want. The strength of the business, such as financial strength, that's really important, and it's very normal if the contractor is going to cost a reasonable amount of money, and they're very important to the project, that you might want to do a financial check on them. And also something like reputation for quality. Now, there could be lots of other evaluation criteria, things like, their location. Maybe you want a contractor that's actually close to where your project is located. And the same thing with building supplies. You probably want to have a local supplier, otherwise delivery costs could be huge. So always document those evaluation criteria, and then when you receive the responses, you should evaluate those responses against those criteria. Now, there's a method of doing this, because not all these evaluation criteria are as important as each other. Some will be less important. So you don't want to be rating them all at the same level of importance. So for that reason, we assign a weight to each one of the criteria. And you can see here that we've got a weight being, in here, we've got 1, 2, and 3, 1 being desirable, 2 being important, and 3 very important. And against each one of those criteria, we will assign a weight. Now, price obviously is very important in this particular case. I actually have seen evaluations where price was only rated 2 because there were other criteria which were actually more important than price, but it's up to you. The quality of work has been given a 3 in this example. Availability according to the schedule, very important, a 3. The size of the team was given a 1, but that can be important if you want some fallback in case someone is ill. If they've got a larger team, then you're not just dependent on one person. The location, in this case, given a 1, desirable. Similar type of contract previously. In this case, they said that was important. Insurance liability, well, that was a 3. And ethical and behavioural attributes and general reputation, a 3 in this case. So there's just a list of criteria. Now, on this little score sheet, we have listed 3 providers, number 1, 2, and 3. And so for each one of those criteria, we're going to score each provider. So in this case, we're going to have a score of 0 to 5. So we score that provider, in this case, provider number 1, we've given a 4 for price, 5 for quality, 4 for availability according to schedule, size of team, 5, location, 4. So obviously they've got a big team and they're in the right area. Similar type of contract, yes, they have that. They've done that before. They've got the required insurances and ethical and behavioural attributes of 5. So they've scored really well. Now, we're going to, in order to give a score that takes into account our weightings, we then multiply the score by the weighting. So we then end up with a weighted score. So you can see here that we multiply the score of 4 by 3, which gives us a weighted score of 12. 5 by 3, we get 15. And so on down the list. We multiply those and then we add up our weighted scores. And so our weighted score for provider 1 is 88. We then do the same thing for providers 2 and 3. We score them against the criteria and then multiply each score by the weight. So in this case, we've got a weighted score of 87. And for provider 3, we end up with a weighted score of 86. You can see in this case, they're all very, very close. But provider number 1 has come out on top. If they're very close, you should make sure that you really go through and double check your scorings, just to make sure that you've been really fair with these things and before you make your final decision. In many cases, you'll find that one provider really stands out, or 1 or 2 will stand out against any others, and that makes it easier to make a decision. But the other thing is, if it's a very important acquisition that you're making, it's often good to get 2 people in your organisation who may be very familiar with the job to actually help with the evaluation and evaluate separately. And I've been in this situation where we've done separate evaluations, and you'll find that usually the scores are very similar, but there will be 1 or 2 items where the scores are different, and that provides you with the opportunity to question why you have scored differently, and then discuss those scores and come up with a compromise score based on the reason for that different score. In the case where I was involved in one where we had 3 people actually doing independent evaluations, sometimes we found that the requirement hadn't been fully understood by one person. or understood, they'd interpreted it differently. So it is important to be fair with things, particularly if it's high value. So you can see here that provider number 1 has the highest score, and let's just say that's the one you really want to choose. So the reason you do this evaluation is that it gives you a very clear understanding as to the rationale behind your choice. And of course, if anyone comes back later on and asks why they didn't get the job, you've got this little spreadsheet to go back to give them the reasons why they didn't score as well on certain things against other suppliers. So it's a very valuable spreadsheet. And of course, if you are doing formal tendering, it's an absolute necessity to do this, but it's still very good to do a simple one for just requests for quotation as well. Now, once you've finished your evaluation, you will, of course, have selected the preferred vendor. Now, if you're working for a larger organization, you might need to obtain approval. Otherwise, you may be able to just approve that yourself. Now, always make sure you advise the selected contractor or supplier in writing as soon as you've made the decision, and then negotiate the contract. Now, typically, if it's a larger procurement, you will have a little contract. A contract's always a good idea unless the procurement's very small. And then also, once you've finished negotiating the contract and both parties have signed it, then notify all the other respondees to tell them they weren't successful. That's always good practice to do that, because people hang on wondering if they've actually got the job or not. And it's good practice to go back to them and let them know that they were unsuccessful in this particular case, because then they can put it aside and concentrate on other things. Now, in terms of construction contracts, there are 5 things which are absolutely important to be covered in the contract. First of all, clearly describe what goods or services must be provided and what will not be provided. In other words, there might be exclusions. So you need to it's very important that you document exclusions, because the person you are contracting with may assume otherwise. So if the same thing, if you are developing a contract with a customer because you've actually provided a quotation for work to build the customer's house or do renovations, it's very important that you describe not only the work you will be doing in very clear detail, and back that up with the specifications and plans if they haven't provided them for you. Maybe you've actually done them yourself. And what will not be provided, because this area about what will not be provided tends to be things that they might assume you're including, and you have to be very clear about what you're not including in this work. I've actually had an experience with a small company years ago where they didn't describe what was not included, and they ended up in incredible conflict with the customer, and it created a really bad relationship going forward. And also because they needed to give in on some of these points, they ended up making a loss on the project because the customer insisted that those particular things should have been included, and they had assumed they would be. So this sort of thing can end up very much in disputes, and in big situations could even end up in court if it's a big thing. So be very careful about that. Now, the contract price must cover all aspects of delivery of the goods or services, and of course should include your profit. So it has to be the overall price of the contract, and particularly for fixed price, that's very, very important. And remember, in some of the other sessions, we were talking about contingencies. So when in the cost session, we were talking about putting contingencies in for fixed price, which you need to put contingencies in for things that can happen that you haven't anticipated, and also to cover your risks as well. So fixed price contracts do tend to be more expensive than time and materials contracts, and that is because the contractor is taking a risk when they're providing that service. So it benefits the customer in the sense that they know how much they're going to pay for something, but of course the contractor has more risk associated with the delivery of that contract, and therefore has to make it a little bit more expensive to cover that. Otherwise they could end up making a loss rather than a profit. Now, payment terms must also be clearly stated. Whether there's progress payments, whether there's a upfront payment, and then progress payments at particular milestones. And also, if, the terms of the payment, how many days after the invoice is provided must the payment be made? And if you're purchasing or supplying materials and equipment, then how many days after final delivery must the invoice be paid? Okay. Now, it should also determine when the work will commence or when the equipment and materials are required, and when the work will be completed. Now, contracts may also contain penalties for late completion, and they can also contain bonuses for early completion as well. So, that's often an incentive. If you are a builder and, time is the essence, and, time is always money, then to incentivize your contractors, it's often good to put those sorts of penalty clauses in, but, offset them with a bonus for early completion as well. And that's very motivating for the contractor. Now, there are things that should be in a construction contract, but contracts also need to include things like covering dispute resolution processes, which are very important. So, and also under what conditions the contract might be able to be terminated, such as poor work quality or etc. So, if you're going to have a contract, you should always have that developed by a legal person. Now, if you're providing the same sorts of services all the time, you can get a solicitor to draft up a contract, which is a general one for the work that's being, type of work that you do, and then you can fill in the details. Now, typically you can have a general contract and then have what we call a statement of work, which will detail things like the specific goods or services to be provided for that particular job and the dates, etc. So the statement of work can sit as a separate document or an appendix to the overall contract. And that's the way a lot of small companies do that. Of course, if the whole job is much larger, then the contract may be a lot more specific. But as a smaller business person, it's always good to just have a general contract and then have a statement of work as an appendix to that. Now, for very small purchases, a contract may not be warranted. So you can always use what we call a purchase order. Now, it's still documenting the agreement and it will have any payment terms listed, but it's just a very small document, where a formal contract is not required or not really worthwhile. So it often a purchase order will have a list of terms and conditions written on the back that might be applicable to that particular organisation, but it's very much just really detailing what is going to be provided. And purchase orders are used very much for materials and equipment, but also it could be used for a smaller contracting service as well. Now, once you've finalised the contract and you're getting to the stage where the person's going to be on board to actually deliver the goods and materials or provide the services, we're going to just talk about managing the contract. Now, if for goods and materials, always inspect and test any goods and materials immediately at the point of delivery, if possible. That way, you can really determine whether, for example, whether the correct goods have been delivered, whether there's been any damage, and whether the quantity is correct. Before you actually sign for acceptance, the more you should do as much checking as possible, because then the possibility of disputes is minimized, because you haven't accepted the goods at that time. If there are things that need to be tested to see if they work, you might be able to test a sample and test the rest upon installation. Obviously, there are some things you can't inspect or test until after that you've received them, but do as much as possible upon delivery and before you sign any acceptance of those goods. It makes your life a lot easier if anything's wrong. Now, for contractors and subcontractors, they're very important to your job, and they can actually be the difference between a successful job or an unsuccessful one. And they impact, a poor contractor can impact your schedule and your budget. And there are plenty of subcontractors around who aren't reliable, who maybe produce poor quality, and they're the ones that you need to avoid, of course. And through your evaluations, hopefully you can avoid that as much as possible by looking at references, etc., if you don't know the contractor. And of course, we all like to stick with the people we do know and can trust. So managing contractors is a very important part of procurement. Now, of course, when your contractors come on board, make sure that you pre-qualify them before they start work. And you should have a contractor induction checklist, and you should verify all the things that that particular contract needs to provide before they start work. And that could include contractor certifications and licenses, any public liability insurance, professional indemnity insurance, workers' compensation or personal accident insurance, plant or equipment certification and registration, safe work methods, procedures and instructions for work, safety data sheets for all hazardous chemicals to be used, or any other permits that are required for that particular contractor. Now, you should make sure that you cite everything that is required from that particular contractor before they start work, and then both parties should sign that checklist has been reviewed, and always obtain copies of the required documentation. For example, insurances, always obtain copies of all the documentation they provide, their licenses, insurances, etc., because that's very important in case there are any questions asked or there are any problems later on. So keep a file for every contractor. Now, when you're managing contractors on site, you should have a site induction meeting for each contractor. Now, you may have depending on what your situation is, you could invite all your contractors to a site induction meeting together, or depends on your situation, or you may induct contractors as they come on site at the time. But the important thing is that contractors and subcontractors you must ensure that they're familiar with the site and able to perform the work safely. So again, have a site induction checklist, and have any required documents and records that are required. Any decisions that are made, make sure that you minute those, and any action items must also be minuted as well and signed by all parties. Now, everybody who attends a site induction meeting must be given minutes of the meeting, and they should sign, and you should also have them sign that they attended the meeting. Now, the sorts of things that you would include in a site induction meeting are things like work health and safety policies, site rules such as mandatory personal protective equipment, drugs, alcohol, smoking rules, etc. Any site emergency evacuation procedures, any first aid and medical emergency procedures. People need to know where the first aid kit is. There needs, for example, and how to get off the site if it's a more complicated site, but in case of emergency. Incident reporting and the investigation process. So the proper form should be available, and they should also be told what the process is for reporting any incidents. There should be sign in and sign out register to make sure you know exactly when people were on site and who they were. The overview of general access and restricted access areas. So it may be that you've got some areas that are restricted access for certain trades because they're perhaps dangerous, and you should probably have those fenced off anyway, but people need to be aware if they're not allowed to access those particular areas. There should be an overview of site hazards. So that means any existing hazards, and also any hazards that may be created by the work being done on the site as well. Risk control requirements such as hazardous chemicals, plant equipment, working in confined spaces, all those sorts of risks, they need to be discussed, and procedures documented on how they are going to be handled. Site amenities and facilities, whether it's a site office, all the amenities and facilities that would be provided for any workers, site parking arrangements, and subcontractor management processes, if there are any others that aren't included there. And subcontractor management processes can include things like regular meetings, inspections, etc. So they should be aware that they are going to need to, participate in meetings as they're working on the site. And there also, of course, should be a review of schedules and major contractual conditions, and also a review of any plans and specifications that may be applicable for the general contractors, or if you're having individual meetings for that particular contractor. So there's a lot to do in site induction meetings. So they're not necessarily short meetings, but if you've got everything prepared and everything clearly defined. You know, they need to know where they can read any procedures that they might want to refer to again, because at the site meetings you tend to talk through these things, but you should also have all your procedures documented and at the site for people to reference. So, site induction meeting, very, very important to kick off the work and set the scene for having a productive and safe work site. Now, just managing contractors on site, of course, you must hold regular inspections and site meetings. You know, it's weekly site meetings are important, and daily, and even and that they'd be formal site meetings for whoever's on site at the time, and also daily toolbox talks to talk about work health and safety. Now, I think yesterday, for those of you who were with us yesterday, I also said, you know, it's important to even have informal site visits as well. You can't beat just turning up unannounced on the site to see what's actually happening, because suddenly you'll find that perhaps no one was there. They came late. You turn up at 9 o'clock in the morning and no one's there, and they should be. So if they knew you were coming, they'd probably make an effort. So always surprise visits are the best way to find out what's really happening. And always, you know, think about that. And, you know, it's only, particularly if you're close by, just drive past and see what's going on. And it's not going to take a long time, but you'll get a much better idea of what's really happening on your site. Now, keep site meeting diaries, which document things like the progress to date, issues, including work health and safety, non-compliance, if someone wasn't wearing a hard hat, for example, any defects. And if you can see any defects already on site, take photos of those and then address them directly after that, and get agreed timeframes for rectification of issues. So always document with site diaries. Now, I know that on site, in building projects I've been involved in, site diaries are often just handwritten because it's easier on the site rather than having to use a laptop or so. It's all up to you. But quite often they can be handwritten, and that doesn't matter. But always give the other person a copy. So if you've got handwritten ones, you should have carbonized paper so that the other party can obtain a copy of that site diary minutes as well. So the diary must be signed by all parties and a copy given to the subcontractor. So very important to keep everything in writing, because you never know when you're going to have to come back to that. And of course, it protects you. Now, if the unfortunate things do occur and you end up having a dispute with a contractor, it's very important to handle that in the right way. Now, the most common causes of disputes are things like poor contract administration, where the employer, contractor, or subcontractor fails to understand and comply with contractual obligations. So this is where you know, all these meetings and inductions are really important, and talking through the contract is very important. And of course, managing that contract by having constant meetings with the contractor to make sure they are complying with the contract. Now, another common cause of dispute is errors or omission in design or specifications. Now, that can be pretty tricky, and often you have to bring in the initial people who developed the designs and specifications, and that can then end up with variations, of course. And of course, contractors, the subcontractors, need to be, if it wasn't their fault, then they shouldn't be paying the penalty for that. There should be a variation raised, which enables them to be paid for the extra work that wasn't their fault. So this can be a difficult one, and if it's large, can end up in quite large disputes, and these sorts of things can end up in court. Now, sloppy quality standards that fail to catch and correct mistakes in a reasonable time frame, that can again end up causing disputes as well, especially if rework has to be done. So again, when you're managing a contract, this is where you need to try and pick up on any problems as quickly as you can to enable things to be fixed before they become too serious. And of course, poor communication can end up with disputes where everyone's got a different idea about what was said or what's happening. So from a project management perspective, communication is just so important. Keep communicating with everybody, your contractors, and the client as well. So always keep everybody informed as to what's happening. And, bring the owners or clients to the site to inspect during the construction, and, provide, and it's better if you're there as a project manager, or, it's better if you're there with the client, because you can discuss things. Things can get out of control if the client just arrives and starts talking to subcontractors. So it's probably good if you arrange with your client to always let you know if they're coming on site, so that you can be there and guide things and be there to handle any issues that may arise. Now, tips for avoiding and minimizing disputes. The first one is building relationships, and that really follows on with what I just said about communication, getting to know people and having good relationships, trying to develop good relationships with everybody, in the customer as well as the subcontractors. Holding regular meetings, again, that's a part of communication. So meetings always provide an opportunity for people to share information, to raise any issues before they become too big, and they can be discussed at that point in time. Another thing is always confirm verbal agreements in writing. Now, I said this was very important with the requirements when you're looking for quotations, but anything that you agree verbally should be backed up in writing, either in minutes of meetings or via an email, because it's amazing how quickly people can forget what they say, or they might like to forget what they said. Or there could be just genuine misunderstandings. So by following up a verbal agreement in writing, it provides the opportunity for all parties to read that agreement, and then if they feel that wasn't what they understood, they've got the opportunity to come back and discuss that right before anything else happens. Always be available to answer questions and discuss issues. So even if you're not on site, always make sure that they've got your mobile phone number. And if there are any issues, encourage people to contact you, and not just keep going and not talking to you, because things will get worse. So this is where having a good relationship also assists with this particular point. Always keep contractors informed of any changes. Naturally, this causes huge issues if there have been changes and not everyone knows about them. That can cause errors to be made, and then also people get angry if they weren't kept in the loop. So very important to keep everybody informed. And of course, lastly, make sure you understand the contract. You're an agent for that contract, and as a project manager, you have to understand that, because you are actually managing that contract. So you need to understand the clauses. And if there are any areas where it seem a bit grey and you're not quite sure about, always go back to either your management or to even the solicitor to have those things sorted out and clarified. So this is where it's important to have very clearly defined contracts that haven't got ambiguous statements in them. So everything should be very simple and very clear. So that will help avoid disputes going forwards. So when all the work's completed, you should formally terminate the contract, and that means both parties should sign. Now, typically in building jobs, the contract isn't formally terminated until the end of the defect rectification or warranty period. In some cases, it may be that you terminate the construction contract and then enter another contract for warranty. That can happen, that there's an additional contract which covers the warranty period. But in most cases, the contract isn't formally finalised till the end of the warranty period.